Greetings, scholars. I hope you're well. I am starting chapter 9, motivation and emotion. One of the most important parts of our survival and how we function as human beings is uh, being motivated and driven to do things. And then the emotions that are associated with our lived experiences. And we'll talk about several theories and how we and why we experience emotions the way we do. But again, motivation is that number one key to our life and what we do. We'll talk about drive, we'll talk about motivation, the intrinsic and extrinsic motivators that keep us moving forward in life. And again, we'll wrap it up with, again, more emotion and the intertwining relationship between motivation and emotion, because without both of them working together in conjunction, our lived experiences would be pretty boring. So we'll talk about that and then we'll finish up. Okay. We're not going to do the icebreaker, obviously, it's reporting, but uh, again, what motivates you to do those things you would rather not do? One thing that uh, comes to mind is school. You know, why are you here at Alabama A&M, and what motivates you to do and to endure some of the things that you're enduring in school? And you know, personally, I felt and continue to feel like education is the greatest equalizer to our society. You know, as African American people, um, you know, we have been behind. There are like larger disparities in healthcare and education and income. And when you think of education, education is that number one thing that helps you to extend yourself to the next level. Not just formal education in the form of going to school, but learning a new trade or learning a new skill. So education does not have to be college. It could be a number of different ways to learn something. Our lives are filled with learning experiences. And so I'm motivated to do things that I'd rather not do, like work out, because I know the benefits of those things in the long run. And, you know, those are incentives that I see uh, personally, tangible and intangible, that help me to move forward. And, you know, things that you are passionate about, such as athletics, you know, the motivation can be different, but oftentimes the motivation to achieve, the emotions that are associated with uh, being rewarded when you achieve something really, really of high magnitude, like graduation. Those are the things that I strive for, because those things feel really good to succeed, to achieve things that at one point didn't seem uh, tangible that I could touch, and then they become something that I can grasp on and hold on to. So, you know, that's something to think about. You know, as you're moving forward, what motivates you? Why is that important? And how can you use your motivation to continue to keep you grounded on your goal and what you want to accomplish? But again, as we think about your why, that's extremely important to understand what your why is. When we think about school, when we think about an undergraduate degree, this is a future thing, right? You want to earn praise, obviously, because um, if you remember your high school graduation, how good it felt to be congratulated for graduating high school. You know, developing yourself as a person. That's one of the keys to education is self-development, self-growth, and maturity, right? And then the last one I'll mention on this list here is, you know, achieving your dreams. If you have a dream or a goal that you want to accomplish in your future self, you know, we all have what we call a future self, hope for self, and when you have a hoped for self, I want to be a doctor one day, right? Uh, there was an instance where I didn't have that possible self, but that was one reason why I kept going in graduate school. And graduate school wasn't all fun, right? There were some really really tough nights, nights where I cried, but all of that made uh, the biggest difference, and that continued my why, the end goal, and becoming a doctor to be a representation. Um, as a Black man, to have a doctorate degree is important to me to be able to show individuals that it is possible. Being raised in a single parent household, um, you know, my mom sacrificing so much for me. And again, she's another why. Family, you know, self development, you know, your future. What do you want your future to look like? So I'm just thinking we'll talk about motivation, but again, um, the bigger picture of why you're here at Alabama A&M or at any university is you know, to determine what those whys are, because those whys help you to maintain a focus when things get a little difficult and you run up against trials and tribulations that we all face through this life that we live. But again, one of my favorite athletes is Kobe Bryant, and he had the Mamba mentality, and the Mamba mentality is, to be your best self, right? That was his motivation to get better every day, be better every day incrementally than he was the day before, right? He wants to make strides to be the best athlete he could be, to be the best in the sport, to be the best in his craft, and he worked extremely hard, and that motivation energized his behavior. He woke up early, stayed late, he put up shots. One of the best athletes of all times because of the motivation that he had to be the best. So we're going to talk about several motivational theories. We'll talk about drive. We'll talk about incentive-based theories. But motivation, again, is that number one key, right? We all have different motivations, and there are an array of different motivations that we have, and we'll study three, the most common. But again, there are so many different motivations and motivators that kind of give us the ability to move forward and to strive for greatness. But what is motivation, right? Before we talk about the theories of motivation, what is motivation? When we talk about motivation, we're talking about a defined goal-directed behavior, right? And we're trying to, in a sense, when we're motivated to do something, we have a goal and we want to achieve that goal. And that motivation is that forward-looking. I like to use the analogy of or metaphor of, your future self is facing you off in the distance. And our motivation is we have this hoped for self that we see off in the distance, and we're wanting to reach that person, whomever it is, whatever they are, doctor, lawyer, mechanic, business owner, entrepreneur, whomever, right? And we're motivated, and what we do, how we behave, our thought process is motivated to reach that goal or that future self that we see. And we have to be motivated in order to reach it. We can't just, it's not going to just happen, right? We have to be motivated to do it. If we want a college degree, it's not going to be given to you. So the motivation to reach that goal is what creates what we call that goal-directed behavior. To get to a place where you want to be, you have to direct your behavior, your thoughts, every part of you in order to reach that goal. And again, one piece of motivation is a desire to escape some form of discomfort that we have in our environment, right? If I'm cold, I'm going to be motivated to put on a jacket to turn off the heat. If I'm hot, I'm going to be motivated to remove clothing or turn on the AC in order to, again, escape the discomfort that I'm feeling. If, I am in a bad crunch with money, right? I'm going to do everything I can to be motivated to get a job or to do things. Sometimes people take the shortcut, right? If I'm motivated and I'm hungry, some people steal food. Some people go to work for food, right? But we're motivated to do things in a certain way based on our motivations. So there are, again, theories that we talk about, many theoretical approaches to what we consider motivation. One of those theories is what we call a drive. What is our drive to do something? And when we talk about drive theories, drive is this hypothetical internal state that's pushing us, right? It's a tension that we have on the inside to engage in activities to reduce the tension that we have on the inside. If I am hungry, right? We talk about hungry. If I'm hungry to do something, right? If I'm hungry physiologically, then I'm going to be driven to go get some food, right? If I have something in the refrigerator, I'll go to the refrigerator, grab something out of the pantry or out of the refrigerator. Or if I don't have anything in the house, I'm driven to go to a fast food restaurant to get some food, or go to the grocery store, go grocery shopping, right? I'm driven to do something. When we talk about drive theory, we're talking about in a physiological state, a homeostasis, right? There's a physiological equilibrium or stability. When I'm extremely cold, the blood vessels in my skin, they constrict, and then I begin to shiver, right? I get cold. And if I'm cold, I start to shiver in order to increase my body temperature so that I remain or get back to homeostasis or equilibrium. If I'm really, really hot, then my blood vessels, they begin to dilate and my skin begins to perspire. Then my sweat glands are activated, right? So now I'm sweating in order to cool my body off in order to reach equilibrium. But these internal states that we feel physiologically help to push us to act in certain ways. Just like our bodies react in certain ways automatically, we are driven to do things based on a tension that we have in order to get ourselves back to an equilibrium state, right? So these unpleasant states that we talk about, the tension are kind of viewed as this disruption of our equilibrium. And so we have a preferred desired state. And when we talk about emotions, that's one thing that we talk about as well. Peace is a desired state for many people. I don't know many people who want to be distressed their entire life. I know people who want peace, right? That's an equilibrium emotionally, right? But there's a preferred equilibrium for everyone. We're all individuals and we have different levels of equilibrium and how, some people in the same room may be hot versus cold. Some people are cold natured, some people are warm natured, just like with emotions. Some people want to feel a certain way based on their personality type, and that's okay, right? But there is what we call a drive, an internal state, an internal tension, and that tension is different for each person. But again, it does drive us to do something. The other theories of motivation, they're what we call an incentive theory. Now, there are incentives, and these are external to us. So drive theory is very internal, and that's something that happens on the inside. We're driven to do something from the inside out. External theory and the incentive theory is these external goals that drive us to motivate us to behavior, right? Like money, or getting an A on the exam or being promoted at work. Those things they give us energy and a motivation to do something, right? In order to get an A on the exam, I'm going to have to move a certain way, study a certain way, act a certain way, behave in a certain way in order to reach that goal. If I want a monetary prize, say to hit the lottery, I'm going to have to go to the state line to Tennessee to go get a lottery ticket. And so that's an external prize, right? That's something, an external goal that I want to achieve, and I'm driven to do that, right? It's like chasing a carrot, right? I see it in front of me, and I need it, so I'm chasing it. I'm chasing it. I'm chasing it, right? So the incentive model emphasizes the role of the environmental factors, those things around us that are driving us to do certain things, right? And so those external stimuli pull us. They're pulling us forward, just like this carrot is pulling us forward to move in a certain way, right? So again, when we talk about the drive theory, the drive theory is internal, the incentive theory is external, and we're emphasizing the pull of something. The drive theory is pushing us to do something, right? If I'm hungry, the homeostasis is disrupted, preferred equilibrium is disrupted. I'm being pushed to do something in a certain way. But when we talk about external, it is pulling me in a certain way to behave, okay? Evolutionary theories say that, again, when we talk about any evolutionary theory, we talk about Charles Darwin, one of the most famous evolutionary theorists. He says that motivation, just like when we talk about emotions, they are adaptive, right? They're helping to solve a problem, right? So motivation is best understood in the terms of this adaptive problem. So we're trying to solve problems based on different motivations. If I'm hungry, I need to go hunt for food, right? So that's a motivation, and those motivations help us to keep going, right? That motivation to search and hunt and gather food is something that keeps us and helps us to survive and to solve problems. So I'm motivated to do that. When I wanted to travel a longer distance, they were motivated to create inventions, right? Create the computer, create wheels, right? Those are motivations to do that, to solve a problem, right? And motivational theorists, they agree that these displays, again, they're enormous motives, including biological and social, right? So being motivated to achieve, being motivated to dominate, aggression, hunger, sex drive, all of those solve problems. Your sex drive, right? For those who are married and want to have children, that motivation to populate and to procreate and have children and offspring, to continue your legacy, that's a motivation, right? Aggression, dominance. You have to have some type of aggression and dominance to gather food, right? If you're fighting or in a conflict with someone who has resources and you need the resources, you need dominance, you need aggression in order to fight to get resources you need to survive, right? Affiliation, we all have this affiliation to belong, right? And so all of these different motivations we'll talk about. Um, but we'll talk about three common ones as we move forward. But these theories of motivation are extremely important when we talk about um, living and surviving um, in the long run. Okay. So it says, which theory of motivation is based on the premise that the source of motivation lies within the organism? So we talk about the internal motivation, we talk about um, the internal desire, and then we talk about the external um, drive theory versus incentive theory. So we talked about evolution, but those two, you can kind of cross this one out, right? But you have to decide between these two. So you can pause it, but the answer is drive theory. So again, you're motivated to pursue actions that will reduce and lead to a drive reduction, right? So this internal state is being disrupted, and so it's pushing you to do something. And that's again, the motivation that lies within you to do something to survive. Okay, there are going to be three common researchers have studied all types of motivations, but the three that we're going to study most specifically here are the most three common that are studied by researchers, and those are hunger, sexual drive, and motivation. And so we're going to cover those three in a little more detail here. These are the three, and these are the questions that we're going to answer as we move forward. So what biological and social factors underlie hunger? That's the number one question, right? We're going to answer that one. What are the varieties of sexual behavior? So we're going to talk about the physiological sexual response and orgasm and reproduction. We'll also talk about, the sexual orientation and what that looks like for human beings and how we have evolved over the course of time. And even over the last few decades, how sexual orientation, sexual preference has been something that's been discussed and studied for several decades now. And then how are our needs relating to achievement, affiliation, power, motivation exhibited? And so we'll speak specifically to achievement. But again, achievement and the motivation for power and affiliation are all important when we discuss the achievement motivation. So motivation of hunger and eating. Let's talk about that, right? So we always have to talk about the biological. One of the biggest things for psychologists is, the physiological state of our being and how that leads to our behaviors. So when we talk about the brain regulation of hunger, the earlier studies found that there are certain structures in our brain that are associated with regulating our hunger response, right? So the earlier studies in the 40s and 50s found that the lateral hypothalamus and the ventral medial nucleus were really the kind of the on and off switch for hunger, right? So the lateral hypothalamus, they did these studies with rats. And so they destroyed the lateral hypothalamus in rats. And they found that when they destroyed that structure in the brain in those rats, that it turned off their desire to eat. And so they just had no hunger response whatsoever. They just were not hungry at all, right? And in the opposite way, when they destroyed the ventral medial nucleus of the hypothalamus, they had this immense hunger. So they gained weight. They couldn't stop eating. They ate even beyond physiological what they really wanted to eat. So they could not stop eating, and they gained a lot of weight. Right. That was the first steps. But what was discovered that it wasn't just the structures that were modulating and regulating hunger. There is what we call a neural circuitry that's happening. So what they were able to find is that the arcuate nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus, those structures also help to modulate hunger. And what's most important when we talk about brain regulation in the hypothalamus is the neural circuits are the key into how we regulate hunger. And it's not so much the structures that are controlling it, because when we think about the brain, our brain is so complex, and the neural circuits are not just they're connected to so many areas of the brain, and that the interchain that we talk about affects every part of the brain in different ways, right? So the neural circuits that regulate the brain in these areas of the brain, in these structures of the brain, those are what's helping to kind of have this reciprocally interconnected, um, connect these communication between different structures of the brain, right? So the circuitry is really sensitive to kind of the diverse physiological processes. And when those structures were then destroyed, then that destroyed the neural circuits, right? Not so much the structure itself, but the circuits, the neural circuits that were connecting certain areas of the brain to one another in order to regulate and modulate the hunger response. When you also think about the biological response of hunger, there's what we call a digestive and hormonal regulation that happens. And there are certain hormones that are released in our body that regulate and cause hunger. Now, in the beginning, it was thought that the stomach and the contractions in the stomach, if we've ever heard our stomach growl, those are stomach contractions that are happening in the background. And it was said that those stomach contractions is what's causing hunger. But what's really happening is there are a variety of hormones that are being released in our system that actually contribute to the regulation of hunger. Now, our stomach even sometimes growls when we're full, right? And so it's not so much the physiological of the contraction of the stomach as much as it is the hormones that are being released. And so there are several hormones that we'll talk about. We'll talk about ghrelin, we'll talk about the CCK hormone and leptin. We'll also talk about insulin. And all four of those hormones are really pivotal in how we regulate regulate hunger. Ghrelin is the hormone that causes the stomach to contract. And then that in and of itself produces hunger. So ghrelin and the brain, right? The hypothalamus is helping us to regulate parts of our hunger. There are some individuals who you remove your stomach, you have to remove their stomach for various medical reasons, and they still have hunger, right? So it's not just the stomach contractions itself, it's the brain that's releasing certain hormones to certain areas of our body that's creating the hunger response. And when the upper intestines begin to stretch, the hormone called CCK delivers what we call satiety signals to the brain, reducing hunger. In our brain, there are certain nerves in our body that stretch and constrict in certain ways that send signals to our brain, letting us know when we're full. And there are certain nerves in our stomach and around our stomach that tell us when we've eaten certain nutritious foods, right? Nutritious foods, right? So when our stomach stretches to a certain level, that signal to our brain that we're full, that we need to stop eating, right? Leptin is also something that's released in our body that contributes to the long-term regulation of hunger. So, when leptin levels are extremely high, we stop eating. When they're really, really low, we want to eat, right? So that helps us to regulate that hunger. And there are fat stores in our body, right? When we have high fat stores in our body, that again, that kind of helps to regulate certain things in our body as well. So leptin levels based on fat stores help to regulate, either increase our hunger response or decrease our hunger response, depending on the amount of fat in the body, right? So if don't have enough fat in the body, so those who have lower body fats, many of them are always hungry because their leptin levels are really, really low, and they need more sustenance, right? Or when you're, a little more overweight, the leptin levels are a little higher, so that contributes to your hunger response as well. Okay. But again, the hypothalamus itself is monitoring different hormones in our bodies. And so when our brain is telling us, okay, it's time to eat, different hormones are being released. The hypothalamus monitors our glucose level, the insulin in our body, the arcuate nucleus and the paraventricular nucleus modulate that hunger in our hypothalamus. And these changes in the chemical composition of our blood with those hormones that are being released, all of that then works together to modulate our hunger response. So again, changes in glucose, when our glucose levels are really, really low. So when we have low blood sugar, it's indicating that our body really, really needs something, right? And when our insulin is really, really high, then it's telling our body, okay, we need to pump the brakes, right? Again, the ghrelin released when we're out without food, and when we fast, it's signaling our brain that your stomach is empty and it's time to eat, which then again creates those contractions in our stomach. And again, as a reiteration, leptin provides information that the body's fat stores are either really high or really, really low, and that regulates hunger by providing a sensation of satiety. And so we have to be really mindful of that, right? How our hormones are being released in our body. And then lastly, insulin is connected to the fluctuations in our body fat. And so again, those who have higher body fat, your blood sugar is going to fluctuate based on the amount of body fat you have. So it's important that you're able to regulate those things in an important way. Okay. So that's the physiological, the biological. Now we have to talk about the environmental factors that might regulate, right? And so when we have this environmental regulation of our hunger, right? Food availability and other related cues help us to, so it's not just the physiological, right? It's not just our brain telling our body, okay, it's time to eat. Sometimes there are, the environmental cues, right? If I see something on the TV and I might not even be hungry, I might have already eaten. If I see something on TV that I really, really enjoy, like a milk pizza, they lift up the slice of pizza, the cheese is really, really melty. I'm like, man, that looks amazing, right? So there are some food availability and related cues that help us to understand and modulate our hunger response as well, right? So palatability is, better tasting foods. We eat better tasting foods. So those foods that are better tasting, we want more of them. When the quantity available, so this happens a lot when, you're around a lot of food. When you're in Thanksgiving and you got a lot of different options, there's a lot of food there, larger plates. If I have a large plate and I got a lot of food on my plate, I'm probably going to eat the food, right? The variety. And again, this has to do with, going to a buffet or going to a potluck or Thanksgiving dinner. The variety of food, people tend to eat more food when there's a greater variety of food options. And so it's important that we monitor, how these cues affect our regulation of our hunger response. The other thing is eating in the presence of others. If I'm eating around people, we usually eat more when we are eating with other people, right? And so we actually, if we're eating with someone else, we watch how they eat and they watch how we eat, and we usually feed off one another and how much we eat. So if my friend is not eating a lot, then I'm probably not going to eat a lot. Just socially, it's just the cue that we have. But again, people eat 44% more when they eat with other people, and so it's just a natural thing. But you're monitoring what other people are eating. There is a misconception though, because women, when they're going on dates, if they go on a date with someone, especially if someone of the opposite sex, they usually do not eat as much, and usually they don't want to seem, I don't know, maybe psychologically they don't want to come off as greedy, or they don't want to give off a bad impression, so they don't eat as much. But maybe when they're eating with other people of the same sex, maybe they're friends, they may eat similar quantities of food based on who they're around. Stress is another environmental cue. People eat sometimes more when they are stressed. They stress eat, or some people don't eat enough when they're stressed. But again, it depends on those different cues. And the last thing is exposure to food cues. Like I talked about, advertisements do it a lot. They dress up the food on the commercials to make them look really, really appetizing, palatable, and it looks good. So you want more of it. The other thing that we talk about is the preferences and habits that we have when we talk about our preferences in food. And many of them are learned, associations that we form through conditioning, right? We learn that there are certain foods that give us a certain feeling when we eat them, like comfort foods, right? I ate pizza when I was younger. You go to Chuck E. Cheese and you eat pizza, and you understand that pizza is really, really yummy, right? And so you eat it, and that's something that you're conditioned for, because again, and sweets is another thing. You're conditioned to taste good, and you're conditioned to see it. Eating habits are also shaped by observational learning, right? So the things that you see other people eating in your environment as a young child, if your mom and dad don't eat vegetables, right, then you're likely not going to eat vegetables. So it's important that we have that understanding about how things are related to those types of things. and how our environment influences our behaviors and our eating preferences and those types of things. So if we want our young people, want our young siblings and our younger brothers to and our children to eat fruit and vegetables, we have to eat it, because when they see us eat it, they're likely going to eat it. Food preferences are, again, are a matter of exposure. And if you expose your children and your siblings to the right amount of food, they're going to, again, want to eat the food. So if they don't know much about fruits and vegetables growing up, and they're not exposed to it growing up, they're not going to prefer that, because they again prefer foods that they are familiar with, right? So if they're only familiar with fast food, that's all they're going to eat, right? But if they're familiar with different types of foods, then they'll be more likely to eat it. Okay. 1 second. All right. So some other social factors in eating. Societal rules. Some societies eating gluttony is not a big thing, and not is frowned upon. And so, societal rules, other cultural influences. There are some cultures that want their children to be overweight. There's a sign of, fertility and health and being healthy. And then individual habits. Some people just prefer to be smaller. And when you see the environment around you, uh, you know, many people way back when, eating a lot was frowned upon. Being overweight was frowned upon, and so people were like, you shouldn't eat that much, and so we'll talk about those those types of influences. But again, a lot of things happen because of our environment, and we're influenced a lot by our environment more than we think we are. So those are some things that we'll talk about. Upward conditioning, obviously associating food with comfort and consolation. We talk about that, and that being one of the key factors, right? If we're reinforced with good emotions when we eat something, right? I love going to Krispy Kreme donuts, because when I eat something that's really, really sweet, especially a donut or ice cream, man, it's comfort food. Makes me feel good. That the dopamine in my system is a big rush. So I continue to eat that because I'm reinforced with these emotions of comfort and peace. And it's just a beautiful thing, right? So we have these other social factors that influence our situation. So this video, I'm going to post all the videos here. I'm not going to play it here, but this video is talking about, what is a food stylist? How do they operate? We talked about the environmental cues and advertisements, right? How we get cues from eating based on what we see on television. And so food stylists, I mean, it's a career, right? I was, blown away at some of the things that they do to dress up, burgers and different foods so that it looks appetizing, as appetizing as you'd ever see it. And so, what you get in the restaurant may not look like what you see on TV, but they dress up the food to appeal to those who may be interested in buying it. Okay. So what is the connection between eating and weight? I will talk about that, the roots of obesity, but the obesity is just the condition of being overweight, and overweight and being overweight and obese is kind of measured by what we call the body mass index. And this is the weight to height ratio that calculates our weight in kilograms, and it divides our weight in kilograms by our height. And so if you're a really, really tall person, your BMI could be a little higher, because again, the proportion, you can be a little taller and be a little heavier and not be considered overweight. But if you are really, really short and your weight is really, really high, then your BMI is going to be too high, and that ratio will then be considered overweight. You also have to take into account, weight and then your body mass, muscle versus fat, right? And so muscle weighs more than fat. So some individuals are heavy, but they are more muscle than they are fat, and so that can contribute to them being overweight. But it's muscle weight versus fat weight, right? Research suggests that approximately 35% of adults are obese, and about 2/3 of individuals in our country struggle with weight. Another 17% of children are obese. And so when you think about children or childhood obesity, again, there are those environmental factors that play a big role because they see and they learn from their environment. Observational learning, as we talked about, conditional and classical conditioning, all of those things play a big role in how we have what we see is childhood obesity, right? But that body mass index we'll talk about a lot. The higher the body mass index, the more prevalence in a lot of the different diseases and ills that we see, comorbidities that we see in our society. Okay. So as you can look at it here, so when we look at height in inches as they increase, and then weight in pounds and kilograms as they increase. So someone who's normal, they're going to be about 110 pounds. If someone who's about 5'11", at about 154, they're normal. But as they start to increase, for someone who's 5'11", as they increase their weight, they become morbidly obese. So someone who is, let's see, I'm 4'7", 5'7", right? And I weigh about 190, 187 or so. So if I go over, right, 190, right about here, I'm considered overweight. I'm 5'7", 5'8". I'm considered overweight, but my body mass index, that's what it says, right? But my muscle mass is a lot higher than my fat. So I think my body fat percentage is probably around maybe 8, 9%, 10%. So again, weight weighs more than fat. Muscle weighs more than fat. So I'm considered overweight based on these scales. But again, you have to take into account some of the other factors that might contribute to that. When we talk about that body mass index, this is the percentage of individuals at particular body mass index. So as your body mass increases, right, you start to see a lot of different medical conditions, right? Hypertension, as your body mass index increases, hypertension also increases, right? Musculoskeletal pain and problems begin to increase. Coronary heart disease, diabetes also increase, right? So all of these things increase as body mass index increases. So we have to be mindful of that as we begin to think about longevity, what we eat, how much we eat, and the effect it has on our body weight and the effects it has on our psyche. We'll talk about that as well. Foods that we eat, the brain, the intestines, the brain has folds, and if you look at the brain and the intestines, they both look very similar because gut health is, that's brain. That's the brain. Down in the stomach is part of the brain and how that functions, right? And gut health and brain health are important, and they're connected in a really important way. So we have to be mindful of that when we consume certain foods. Some other things that cause obesity, again, genetic predisposition, create vulnerability to obesity. There have been studies that show that, there is a predisposition. They do twin studies that show that, an obese twin is likely going to have another obese twin, even though they might be reared apart. Someone who's obese in one twin, identical, their twin has a good likelihood to be obese as well. Obviously, excessive eating and inadequate exercise. So your caloric intake plays a big role. So if your caloric intake and the calories that you burn are on opposite ends. So if you have a surplus of calories, you're going to gain a lot of weight. If you have a deficit of calories, and you're going to begin to lose weight in a very fashion, that there's 3,500 calories make a pound. Right. So if we're in a surplus and we add up to 3,500 calories, then we're going to add a pound on. And if we get a deficit, then we can lose weight a little better. But again, we have to think about eating increases calories. Exercise helps to decrease the amount of calories they burn calories. So we have to find that balance so that we can maintain our weight. Insufficient rest and inadequate sleep impacts the hormones that are released in our body. When we're sleep deprived, we make worse decisions. We talked about decision making, but we think about choice overload. We think about decision fatigue later in the day. If I don't If I've made a lot of decisions in that day, I'm going to make some bad decisions health-wise in what I eat. Instead of eating what I have at home, already prepared, I'm going to go to Burger King and get something that's unhealthy, right? And then the human body is just wired to keep weight within a narrow range. It's called what we call a set point. Um, so you're going to hover around a certain weight. You're going to gain weight, and then you'll lose it back down to a certain weight. And you might even lose a little weight, below that set point. But that set point is kind of where you hover. Right now, I'm kind of stable around 185. I'll balloon up to about 195 or so, then I can get back down to under 185. So maybe it's around 190, but I hover around, between 180 and 195, and that's kind of where I stay. That's kind of my stability, that natural point, and kind of where my body stays. And it really depends on how much I'm eating. If I'm eating excessively bad food, then I might not have a good. But if I'm eating pretty good, then it does pretty well. So here's just a comedic, relief. This is the Klump family dinner. You've all seen Nutty Professor. Uh, Observational learning. You see the young man, he eats because his family eats, right? And so, we have to be mindful of how we are eating around people, because we pick up on different habits, eating habits based on our friends and our family. And when Professor Klump was trying to lose weight, his family was clowning him. They were trying to say, "Hey, man, you don't need to lose weight." And there's diversity. That we got to have some people who are small, some people who are big. Um, you know, some people who are tall and short. But again, our health is tied to what we eat. Um, and we have to be mindful of that when we talk about our motivation to eat and not eat certain things. Okay. All right, sexual motivation and behavior. We talk about sex a lot the psychology and motivation, because sex is just a part of life. We are sexual creatures and beings, and as organisms, that's what drives us a lot of times. When we talk about reproducing, we're motivated to create another life, to continue um, some of the characteristics and traits of who we are. That's what that is. That's what that means. Okay. All right. So we have the human sexual response, right? When we think about the human sexual response, there are four stages of sexual cycle there. We'll talk about that. Yeah. So the four stages of the sexual response cycle include excitement, plateau, orgasm, resolution. Okay. So the first piece is excitement, right? We've all been there. We've all been excited sexually. Again, there's a sexual response cycle, right? And so this cycle, it goes up and it comes back down, right? So we're really, really excited. You have muscle tension, respiration rate, heart rate, blood pressure increases. Um, the vasocongestion, engorgement of blood vessels occurs, right? So this is when you're getting aroused, right? You're kissing your favorite person, you're hugging your favorite person. You see something that mentally stimulates you, then you get this excitement, right? And that excitement creates this physiological response in your body. And, erection and different areas start to moisten. Again, that is the physiological response to the excitement that happens. It's automatic, it's hard to control. So it's not something that to be ashamed of or embarrassed about. It's just something that happens when you're excited, right? Then you have what we call a plateau. This is when we call the physiological arousal continues to build and build and build, but it builds at a much slower pace. So you have this original excitement here, right? This is for males, it's for females, but it's a similar cycle. You have the excitement, gets you to a certain point, intensity, arousal, and then you plateau to a point, right? Maybe you're making out and you kind of reach that point where you're kind of just plateaued. And then when you are having sexual intercourse, then you have what we call an orgasm, right? You have an orgasm, and after the orgasm, you reach this peak of intensity. It's discharged in a series of what we call those muscular contractions. Maybe you ejaculate in a way for men, female ejaculation as well, and it pulsates through the pelvic area. Kind of boom. It's kind of this really euphoric feeling, the orgasm, right? Then what we have is a refractory period for men, right? You have a refractory period for men, and then you have what we call the resolution. The Resolution is that physiological changes. Again, you gradually subside, right? So you have this excitement, you have this plateau, you orgasm, and then you're at resolution. You're good, right? You have this peace, this kind of, they call that post-ejaculation kind of peace you have. After the orgasm, you have what we call a resolution. What happens for men and females, it varies, right? Very, very different, because males usually have one orgasm in them, and then they get the resolution. And then they have to wait a little bit before they can get back to the point where they can get back up, right? Get back up to that intensity of arousal to orgasm, right? So that's why men have to sometimes take a break after they ejaculate. They have to take a break. They have to recover in order for their intensity of that arousal to be able to get re-excited, right? Women can have multiple orgasms over and over again. That's just something physiologically that happens for females that does not happen for men, right? But again, that refractory period is that time and space where you have to recharge. But the resolution is about the same for both men and women. Okay. So what is the evolution behind, that sexual motivation? We talked about the excitement, the plateau, having the intensity of the arousal, then having the orgasm, and then the resolution. But what causes that to happen? And there are two different theories. And one of the theories, obviously, is going to be kind of that parental investment theory. Why do we have sex? One of the biggest things and reasons we have sex, again, is to reproduce, right? But again, the parental investment theory suggests that, we have sex for various reasons. And we view sex very differently. Men view sex very differently than women view sex, right? And we have to be really mindful of that as we pick our partners, right? Men view sex very differently, right? So there is a difference in males and females in parental investment, right? We have what we call great adaptive significance that leads to those differences. And we'll talk about that. So when we talk about the biological reality, reproduction involves minimal investment, right? Minimal time, minimal energy, and risk for males. However, for women, when we talk about reproduction, it involves substantial investment, right? You have a womb that's body's being formed in the womb, and 9 months, energy, a lot of risk. You have to maintain, your energy, eat the right things so that your pregnancy is a great pregnancy. And then what we call the evolutionary sequence, right? We want to maximize reproductive success by seeking more sexual partners, right? So some men are a little more promiscuous than women because, again, they are seeking more sexual partners with high reproductive potential, right? They maximize their reproductive sex, and they may not want kids, but that's the brain. That's the brain, and that's what's happening in a male's brain. For women, they want to maximize reproductive success by seeking partners who are willing to invest material resources in their offspring. So they're selecting individuals who they think are going to be able to provide, right? Who is going to be able to provide? When we talk about the behavioral outcomes, men have more interest in uncommitted sex than women do, oftentimes. We have a greater number of sexual partners over their lifetime, and we look for youth and attractiveness in our partners, right? In contrast, women have less interest in uncommitted sex, smaller number of sexual partners over a lifetime. They look for income, status, and ambition. I mean, these things are evolutionary proven to happen. And if you study these different characteristics, even these behavioral outcomes, you'll see that in men and women across cultures, across the world, these things are pretty common among men and women around the world, right? So when we think about men and women and how they view sex and how they interact in sex and their view of sex, it's biological, evolution, and their behavioral outcomes are based on those two things, right? So when we think about men and women and the differences, we have to think about the biological reality and the evolutionary significance and how that may influence and has influenced men and women even current day. Okay. So there are, again, gender differences in the patterns of our sexual activity as well, right? Men have more sex. That is just a given. We have more sex. We're more interested in sex, even through time. From 25 to 54, that difference is not that big of a difference, but you do see a gap as we begin to age, when there is a larger gap that is created for men and women. A survey, and it shows that, you know, percentage of respondents gave rating of 6 or greater. Again, they think of sex in a different way, above 6 points, right? You got a smaller gap here, and again, as you age, that gap begins to widen. So the sex and the interest in sex increases or continues to be a little more higher for men than it is for women across our lifespan. One other thing we talk about when we talk about the motivation for sex is kind of the mystery of what we call sexual orientation. Sexual orientation is just our preference for emotional and sexual relationships with those of the same sex, the other sex, or either sex, right? So when we think about these different classifications, you have heterosexuals, those individuals who emotional sexual relationships with members of the other sex, bisexual, those who can seek sexual relationships and emotional relationships with either sex. Homosexuals are people who seek sexual and emotional relationships with people of the same sex. And we think of asexuals. These are individuals who are non-sexual, who have no interest at all in sexual behavior with other people. Excuse me. You have autoromantic, you have demisexual, and then you have sapiosexual. Demisexual, they have to have a really big emotional connection with someone before, develop emotional connection before they can um, even engage in any sexual activities with anyone. And then sapiosexual, they find enjoyment and sexual gratification in individuals who are intelligent, right? And so these are all different orientations that people ascribe to, and uh, researchers are studying them to see how they are developed and how they might be different for individual people, individual races, and genders. Okay, here's just what we call the spectrum, right? You have what we call the spectrum in identity, right? It's gender identity. You have a spectrum in our expression of gender, biological sex, and then also sexual orientation. But as you can see, there is no, there are some extremes on the ends, but everything is a continuum. And we'll talk about that. Sexual orientation is also a continuum. Many people are not just strictly heterosexual or strictly homosexual, right, or strictly bisexual. Many people, even if they are heterosexual, men included, have thoughts of people of the same sex, right? It's not just completely heterosexual where all they think about is women, right? Or men only think about women only think about men. There are thoughts and attractions to other people, and it's kind of fluid. Okay. Kinsey had this view of sexual orientation on what we call a 0 to 6 scale. And the 0, we have exclusively heterosexual, and 6 is exclusively homosexual. But again, this is on a continuum. The endpoints are 0 and 6, but we all lie on some sort of continuum. If you're looking at 1, these individuals who are predominantly heterosexual, but incidentally, they have some homosexual tendencies and maybe some attraction to individuals of the same sex. Whereas individuals who are 5, they are predominantly homosexual, but again, they have some incidentally heterosexual tendencies of attraction to individuals of the opposite sex. And you have some who are equally both, right? Bisexual here. But again, we're all on a continuum, and research has shown that the amount of people who are experimenting with individuals of opposite sex and same sex is increasing. I mean, it's actually doubled over the course of time, right? So these recent trends show that same-sex activity has increased from the 80s on up through the 21st century, right? So this is the percentage of individuals who report having sex with at least one person of the same sex after the age of 18. So you see um, almost 4% here, 1.5% for men here, right? And so that has almost doubled for both men and women when we think about individuals having sex with people of the same sex, right? So it's becoming a trend that is increasing, and it'll continue to trend because I don't see this flattening out anytime soon. Because again, the environment, the social experience is increasing the likelihood that people are going to have experiment outside of just the norm. When we talk about gender, non-conforming behaviors, it's happening more and more now because we're a lot more free. Uh, Technology is allowing for us to see more things. We're exposed to different things, and we're exploring more and more about our sexuality. Okay. Here are some theories that homosexuality or just our sexual orientation is based on our environmental experiences that we've had. And research on homosexuals has kind of yielded a number of insights that we'll talk about. So, people who are extremely feminine behavior in boys or extremely masculine in young girls, that does predict subsequent development in homosexuality, right? So people who grow up just naturally a little more masculine, a little more feminine, tend to uh, be and develop homosexuality later on in life. Most gay men and women report that they can trace most of their sexual or homosexual leanings back to their early childhood, which it's a nature and nurture thing, right? So many people would like to say that they grew up in uh, around a lot of women, right? But they were going to be homosexual anyway because of just their leanings as a child, right, or a woman as a child. But again, also most report that they initially struggled to deny their sexual orientation. But as you can tell and see, there was research that was done where researchers asked those who are homosexual, men and women, to um, send them maybe videotapings of them as children, right? And many of the children who were more gender non-conforming, those who again were more masculine or were more feminine, tend to um, they tend to ascribe, their feelings of homosexuality leanings back to that point, and that's why they have that sexual preference now. And so we're finding out more and more that there is some biological precedence to why individuals who uh, are homosexual have those leanings now, because it is something that they developed when they were young. Okay? Again, when we talk about the biological theories of homosexuality, we always have to look at how genetics plays a role. And here are some results of some really important and insightful studies back in the 90s, which suggest that genetic predisposition to homosexuality is actually something that happens, right? So the heritability of sexual orientation appears to be very similar in men than it is in women. So if you look at identical twin studies for men and women, um, about 50%, right, percentage of relatives with a sexual orientation. So in identical twins, they have again 100% of their genetic relatedness, right? Almost 50% of males twins. Um, if the if the if one twin was gay, the other twin 50% of the time was also going to be gay. The same thing for females, and that number decreases. Those percentages decrease as the amount of genetic relatedness begins to decrease. So 50%, then that reduced to about 21% here, 23, 24%. And when there's no, we talk about adoptive siblings, there is 10% or almost 8 to 9% here, right? So again, the roots of homosexuality may again rely in the predisposition based on genetics, and then also in the neurological development that happens when children are being developed in their mother's womb, right? But again, there is uh, some uh, some evidence that there is some biological predisposition to why individuals may be experiencing homosexuality. And then when we talk about orientation, for men, men are a little less malleable and fluid in their sexuality than women are. Women can kind of go on a continuum back and forth. Men usually they may experiment, but they're oftentimes going to go back to their main sexual orientation or preference, and they're a little less malleable and fluid in that. Okay. And here are just some things to think about. When we think about those preferences and sexual preferences, one of the questions: why might it be difficult to track the prevalence of same-sex sexual activity or homosexuality. And, it's hard because you just don't know when that stuff happens. I mean, you're depending on someone to tell you when, right? They felt those feelings, and sometimes they can't pinpoint. They can try, but oftentimes you can't pinpoint when you felt a certain way. Okay? Achievement motivation. So this will be part one. We'll finish on achievement motivation, but motivation is really, really important when you think about um, being successful, you know, uh, in life, not just in school, but work, life, and what we want to accomplish. There are individual differences in our personality and how we want to achieve. There are different levels of achievement and how and who wants to achieve and why they want to achieve. And there is again, what we call individual differences in how we want to achieve. There might be some people who have really, really high motivation to achieve, and then others who may not based on their personality. But achievement motivation or achievement motive, this is just your need to master a difficult challenge, to outperform someone, uh, to meet high standards of excellence that you set for yourself, that your parents have set for you. But this achievement motivation has been investigated for years, and it's difficult to just ask somebody what their achievement motivation is. You have to measure it in some way. And one of the biggest ways and the most common ways that it's been measured over the last several decades is the thematic apperception test, or the TAT. And this TAT, it requires subjects to look at these ambiguous figures, ambiguous images, right? It might be a woman living, sitting at a desk and looking off into space, or a man standing over a desk looking at some drawings on a desk, right? And the uh, the researcher is going to ask you to interpret, what do you see? What do you see in this image, right? So those with a higher need for achievement are going to see certain things versus those who have a lower need for achievement, right? And there is the interpretation of what people say. This kind of reveals their personal motives and their traits, right? If they see someone standing over a desk of drawings or images, and they say, "Man, he's looking to, he's looking at uh, blueprints for his home, or he's looking at a project for his research." Their motivation and their traits might be different than someone who sees, those are divorce papers. You know, he's confused about what he's trying to solve, right? So those things can contribute to how someone might view motivation. Those who have high need for achievement tend to work a lot harder and are more persistent on tasks. They usually are more likely to delay gratification to pursue long-term goals versus those who don't have higher motivations to achieve. But again, those vary in individual differences. As humans, we just vary in the amounts of motivation that we have. And sometimes that might be, from our experiences that we've had over the course of time. But again, you just have to be mindful of how you feel, the motivation that you have, and these are just things that happen. Those who have higher motivation to achieve, uh, you know, usually have higher educational attainment and greater success in business. But again, that's shown over the course of time. It's not a cause, definitely not a cause. When we talk about correlation, there's no causation, but there is a relationship between someone being higher need to achieve and their educational attainment. And those who have higher educational attainment usually are going to get better jobs, get better, higher income, better life outcomes, health outcomes, all those different things as well. Okay. So, what are those situational determinants for why someone might achieve and pursue achievement, right? And that depends on three things. One of them is the strength of one's motivation to achieve. So that's the individual differences that we talked about, right? So some individuals just have a higher motivation to achieve success. Then you have number two, one's estimate of the probability of success, right? If I think I can do it, right? I'm an ex-athlete. I played baseball. I ran track. I played football, right? So if someone challenged me to a race, or they challenged me to lift something in the gym, my probability of success in lifting a weight that I know I can lift, I'm probably going to be a little more confident and pursue that to achieve the success in that versus me knowing I can't lift something, I'm not going to achieve it, so I'm not going to go after it. And then the last thing is what we call the incentive value of success, right? Which depends on tangible and intangible rewards that we get from achieving something, right? So I'm going to achieve something, I want to get A in the exam or A in the class. If that's something that matters to me, then I'm going to go and achieve it. If getting A's in school is not something that is of high incentive value of success for me, then I don't really care about it. I'm not going to go pursue achievement, right? And there's a joint influence of these situational factors, right? And that explains sometimes why higher achievers prefer tasks of intermediate difficulty, right? So probability of success and incentive value. Again, those two things combined really explain why people will choose something that is, you know, uh, moderately so they can achieve it. They want to achieve it, and then they want the reward for achieving it, right? So easy tasks are less satisfying, and harder tasks become less likely. And so you make and draw those balances there. The strength of one's motivation to achieve success, that's kind of the individual, right? That's strictly on the individual. But again, the probability of success and the incentive value of those social determinants that kind of jointly influence why someone would try to achieve and want to achieve, perceive, or pursue achievement in a certain area. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and then we'll pick up, and I'll finish up on part 2 of this lecture.